All right, let's look at pelvic versus lumbar motion, and in particular also the pelvis moving on the femur or the femur moving on the pelvis to create hip flexion or hip extension, and then what happens to the lumbar spine for those motions. Oh. All right, here we go. So there's something called a short arc or pelvic on femoral motion. So if you imagine yourself standing up, right, and putting your hands right near your ASIS and then the posterior side of your pelvis, and then just going into anterior pelvic tilt, so aka duck butt, or tucking your tush in and going into posterior tilt and going back and forth, right, anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt. That is your pelvis moving and your femur is stationary. Sorry about that. So you have an anterior motion, your pelvis moving on your femur that basically looks like hip flexion. It is. Sometimes it's called postural hip flexion, or posterior tilt, or the reversal of anterior tilt, and a posterior motion of your pelvis on your femur, pushing you into hip extension. So this is a way to be in hip flexion and hip extension without moving your leg. You're just moving the pelvis and your femur is stationary. Right? So that's short arc or pelvic on femoral hip flexion and hip extension, sometimes also called postural hip flexion or extension. Here's the long arc. So this is basically you're bending over, right? You're going into hip flexion. And so this is not just moving just the pelvis, but moving the entire upper body. Sorry. So this is complete hip flexion, as you can see, and then you have a little bit of lumbar flexion involved in that. And then here again is just your femur is stationary, and this is short arc, just the pelvis moving and not the upper limb. Okay, here's the whole upper body moving, pelvis moving on the femur, plus the entire upper body. So that's a long arc hip flexion, and this is a short hip flexion. And you can do the same thing in extension, right? So you can move the femur on the pelvis, so go into leg extension, or hip extension, sorry, which is what we think of typically. Or you can do your whole upper body with a posterior tilt of your pelvis plus the whole upper body. Or you can just do the pelvis itself on the femur. And then also what this does not show is that the third option would be you standing straight and lifting your leg into hip flexion, and that would be femur on pelvis motion. So you can have pelvic on femoral motion, just anteriorly and posteriorly tilting your pelvis, or moving your entire upper body anteriorly or posteriorly. Or you can get hip flexion by moving your distal limb and then going into hip flexion or hip extension. That's it.